get started. Good evening. I want to welcome everybody to Smith's Castle and to our continuing reading series on the lawn. Thankfully, we're able to do this. This is our second time only this year since we started back up again, so it's nice to get a nice group of people out and get the fresh air and listen to a little bit of history as well. I had originally scheduled Charlotte earlier in the month, and it fell close to the time of the anniversary of the Great September Gale of 1815. I just happened at the time to be reading this book by Eric Dolan, A Furious Sky, A History of Hurricanes, and it's a fascinating book, and in that, of course, was the gale of September 1815, and of course it caused a tremendous amount of damage in Providence. It set the surf up going right up the Providence River, destroyed all the wharves in Providence, flooded the entire city. Here in Wickford it destroyed wharves and damaged houses as well, and of course here at Cocumscusick it took down the gray old apple tree that had marked the spot where the soldiers were buried from King Philip's War. So the location was lost to us after that over the years of time. But one of the people who lived through that gale was famously Oliver Wendell Holmes. Some of you who may remember, statesman, poet, and he wrote a poem in 1836 remembering that day in which he was 11 years old, the day that the great gale of 1815 came through his home near Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so this poem writes the September gale. It chanced to be our washing day, and all our things were drying. The storm came roaring through the lines and set them all a-flying. I saw the shirts and petticoats go riding off like witches. Bitterly I wept, I lost my Sunday breeches. Fun bit of history there. So, I'm very happy that Charlotte is able to be with us tonight, and she is going to talk about her chapter in an academic book that is about Roger Williams, The Architecture of Religious Freedom. Please help me welcome Charlotte Carrington Farmer.
Thank you. And am I okay to take my mask off here, Bob? Is that the idea? Okay, all right. I just got my negative COVID test just as I was driving here. We're getting tested twice a week at Roger Williams University, so I can be reasonably sure I'm okay. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. Every time I come here, I always comment on what a lovely view it is. You get the view of me, but I get the beautiful view of you folks and the water behind us. So, as Bob says, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my chapter, Roger Williams and the Architecture of Religious Freedom, which came out earlier this year, like literally 2 months ago in this book. Hold on, my clicker, what here? In this book, which I have here. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. So when the editors reached out to me and pitched the idea about writing a chapter on Williams as the opening chapter, as you can see, I don't know if maybe you can see this, it is the opening chapter over here. It's the first chapter. Pitched the idea about me writing this opening chapter in a book that was about the relationship between law and religion and the state that was going to be published by Hart, which is a law imprint for Bloomsbury Press. I panicked, to be honest, for two reasons. I panicked firstly because they wanted me to write for both a general audience, but also giving the press and the other contributors, also for legal scholars. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, I really did wonder if I had anything new to say about Williams. As John Barry notes, within the Academy, Williams is one of, if not the most written about person from New England's 17th century. And I thought long and hard about what could I possibly have to add to the rich existing historiography on Williams. So I did really ponder this long and hard before I said I'd write this chapter. And I really thought long and hard about what made Williams worthy of being the chapter that opens a book about law, religion, and the state. And as a scholar who prides herself on doing bottom-up history from below, and trying to centre marginalised voices, you know, I really wanted to be careful about writing a hagiography of a great white man history. So I wanted to really keep that in the back of my mind, and that's even more in my mind if I think about Trump's comments about trying to do more patriotic history that just came out this week. But that wasn't in my mind because he hadn't said that last summer. Anyway, Williams was indeed a complicated man who lived during a complicated time, and the living in the reality of a society that was founded on the principles of religious freedom was also very complicated. So as a social cultural historian, not a historian of theology, not an ecclesiastical historian, what really struck me as I thought about what made Williams worthy of being the opening chapter was what I went on to term in the book the lived reality of religious freedom and separation of church and state. So what does this term lived reality mean? Well, in a time where state religion ruled and dissenters faced banishment, corporal or capital punishment, I think the small colony of Rhode Island was arguably one of the freest places in the Western world. But, living in the midst of, rather than simply theorizing about the separation of church and state, came at a price. So this lived reality of the architecture of religious freedom that Williams built is going to be the theme of my talk with you this evening. And I'm going to plan to talk for around 45 minutes or so, and then have some time for some Q&A. This has been a bit temperamental. There we are. I'll just press it a few times. So our story then of how Williams founded a colony based on religious freedom starts here in London. So Williams grew up in a world of religious turmoil where the official state religion switched on the whim of a monarch. So following King Henry VIII's break with Rome, England switched back and forth between being a Protestant country and a Catholic country. And Williams himself reflected upon this upheaval and the resulting false conversions in his book that was published in 1640. In this book, Christians Make Not Christians. And so I'll share, this is the front cover you see, and then this is a quote I want to share from Williams. So Williams wrote that when England was all popish, i.e. Catholic, under Henry VII, how easy conversion wrought to half papist, so half popish means Catholic, sorry, half papist, half Protestant under Henry VIII, and from half Protestant, half popery under Henry VIII to absolute Protestantism under Edward VI, from absolute Protestantism under Edward VI to absolute popery under Queen Mary, just like the weathercock with the brevity of every prince, to absolute Protestantism under Queen Elizabeth, and so on. So he's basically saying that from when Henry VIII breaks with Rome and wants to marry Anne Boleyn, it flip-flops it back and forwards. And so this is the norm, right? This state dictating religious freedom. So it's against this backdrop then that Williams witnessed firsthand how the state could pollute the church. And across the Atlantic here in the small colony of Rhode Island, Williams wanted to create something different. So Williams grew up within the Church of England under King James in the Smithfield district of London. Here. So this is a map of London as Roger would have known it before the Great Fire changed everything in 1666. So close to his home on Cowes Lane, which is just here on the map here, this is Cowes Lane. Close to his home on Cowes Lane, there was a livestock market. Sorry, my clicker's not working. There was a livestock market here. You can see the cattle being traded there. And it was also a bustling hub of Dutch traders. But it was also close to Newgate Prison. Oh yes, my clicker's working here. So in purple is Roger Williams' parish church, St Sepulchre without Newgate, and then next to it in red is the prison. So St Sepulchre without Newgate, Roger's parish church, was the closest church to both the prison and the execution site. And Williams was well aware of the long history of persecution in the area. Well aware of this. So in The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, Williams reflected on what you can see on the screen here, the death of John Lambert, who was burnt alive at Smithfield before Williams was born in 1538. So although Williams hadn't been born at the time of the execution, Williams was well aware of the long and bloody history of Smithfield, and Williams reflects in 1652 that Lambert was a true follower of the Lamb of God who cried out in the midst of the flames. You can see this here, right? He cried out in the midst of the flames, none but Christ, none but Christ. So Roger Williams' area of Smithfield gained further notoriety, not only when many Protestants were burnt alive there under Queen Mary, but also when it was the site of the final burning of a religious heretic in 1612. So again, we're not sure when Williams is born. We think it's around 1603. So we estimate that when that final final burning happened, Williams was around 8 years old. And, you know, he described, not he, but people described how for humans to arrogantly assume that God embraced any other state than ancient Israel. And as the colony grew, Williams renewed the colony's commitment, and I quote again, still to hold forth liberty of conscience. And in the 1640 report of arbitrators at Providence containing proposals for a form of government, the colony's government was described as, and I'm going to read a quote to you, democratical, that is to say, a government held by the free and voluntary consent of all, or the greater part of the free inhabitants. And Williams then later elaborated that governments, and I quote again, have no more power than the civil power or people consenting and agreeing shall entrust with them. So Williams went on to reject the idea that God lent his authority to government. And Williams' bold vision played out in reality in Rhode Island, and the government got its power from the people and their consent, and majority ruled. What's also really interesting to me is office holders in Rhode Island did not have to pass any religious or social test, as Williams was determined at this point to prove that a person's religious beliefs had no bearing on their ability to serve in public office. And within the Bloody Tenet that he published in 1644, Williams summarised his vision, and I quote again, he says, "I infer that the sovereign original and foundation of civil power lies in the people. The government of the civil magistrates extends no further than over the bodies and goods of their subjects, not over their souls." So Williams then had effectively separated church and state. I'm going to just walk over here and do the clicker. I'm getting a few steps in. So thinking about this theme of democracy, then I teach a class on campus on the challenges of democracy. So that was really in my mind as I was writing this. So I think Rhode Island's commitment to democracy stood in contrast to both what was going on in England and the rest of New England. So a civil war with Parliament brewed in England in 1642. King Charles I, you know, before he had his head chopped off, evaluated that there were three kinds of government amongst men: absolute monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And so this is what he talks about, right? This is the king's answer to the 19 propositions that Charles publishes basically when Parliament have got him hedged into a corner. They're telling him he needs to compromise his power, that, you know, we think he might have like Catholic connections, his kids have got to grow up Protestant. And then he responds this is his response back to it. So I'm just going to start, I'm just reading, this is the front cover, and then this is a quote I want to share with you. So he said there are three kinds of government, that's where I'm starting, all of which had their particular conveniences and inconvenience. And Charles rejected democracy to affirm that monarchy was the way forward, unsurprisingly, as the King of England. He said, you know, the ills of democracy are tumults, violence and licentiousness. And this was the standard view, right? John Winthrop, governor of Mass Bay, also agreed with him, declaring that democracy is, amongst most civil nations, accounted the meanest and worst form of government. John Cotton, right, teacher of the Boston Church, also agreed, and I quote, "Democracy I do not conceive that ever God did ordain as fit a government, either from church or commonwealth." And Cotton posed a question: if the people be governors, who shall be governed? And Williams had an answer for him. He said, you know, his answer was clear: the sovereign, original and foundation of civil power lies with the people. So Williams knew firsthand that the quest for religious uniformity did not actually ensure social stability and peace in reality. So we know, I'm going to come over here. We know then in March 1644, the Parliament's Committee on Foreign Plantations granted Rhode Island a charter. And whilst Rhode Island had to adhere to English laws so far as nature and constitution of the place will admit, and you can see that this is where I'm quoting for, right, the authority of the government, and then I'm going to pick up the quote here where that arrow is. So I just wanted to show you, test your paleography skills reading 17th century handwriting. So Rhode Island had to adhere to English law so far as the nature and constitution of the place will admit. The committee authorised Rhode Island to continue with its experiment in democracy. Rhode Islanders, and I quote again from the document a bit later on, had full power and authority to govern and rule themselves by such a form of civil government as by voluntary consent of all or the greater part of them shall find most suitable. So by leaving decisions to majority rule, the committee effectively allowed sole liberty to rule in Rhode Island. And I feel like in many ways this early charter of the 1640s was revolutionary. I think part of its long-term impact was hampered by turmoil that was going on both sides of the Atlantic. And I feel like in the midst of this turmoil, Roger sailed back to England with John Clarke in 1651 to try to secure a stronger charter for the colony. And following the execution of Charles I, England, I feel like, had bigger issues to deal with. It had bigger fish to fry than resolving the conflict with this small radical colony across the Atlantic. But following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the charter issue was finally resolved when Charles II approved the charter for Rhode Island in July of that year of 1663. Oh, thanks, Bob, that's great, perfect. So Charles II's royal authority really does dominate, right? You see this here. Every time I see this, and I'm going to ruin this for you too, every time I see this, all I can think of is Disney's Captain Hook. And I tell you that because none other than like Lane Sparkman, right, like the state archivist, right, whose job it is to preserve these documents, she told me that. So I feel like she not ruined it for me, but like shared that with me. So it's my job to do that to every time I show this document. And so, you know, that she did say that, you know, Disney could have used this as inspiration. So Charles II, not Captain Hook, dominates the charter. And it's no accident that his portrait is so big, and that is the first thing that you see. So in addition to this large portrait of Charles II in the top left-hand corner, the charter opened with Charles II by grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, Ireland, defender of the faith. And it was Charles II's own father who'd been executed by a parliament headed by Puritans in 1649. And he was the one who officially said in 1663 that Rhode Island can be this testing ground. So for the king, the colony was far enough away and small enough to experiment with what that meant to have a lived reality of religious freedom. And the charter famously signified that it was indeed a lively experiment with a full liberty in religious concernments. And I feel like the language from the charter stating that no one could be molested, punished, disquieted or called into question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion was used in other colonial charters, notably New Jersey and Carolina. And Williams knew how important this language was. You know, he writes about the charter in a couple of letters after he gets it, and some of my favourite letters are him reflecting on this. So in 1670, Williams still held on to the legal and symbolic value of the 1663 charter, and he said the king's extraordinary favour to this colony, that's what he described the charter as. So he knew full well what it meant to have the king's endorsement, and he wrote this in a later letter too. He said, His Majesty declared himself that he would experiment whether civil government could consist with such a liberty, with such a liberty of conscience, right? So he knows what the king is doing when he does this. So though Rhode Island was only a small corner of the English Atlantic, Rhode Island was, and I quote again from Williams, a shelter for the poor and persecuted. And Roger again says, the king's approval, and I quote, showed all the world to see His Majesty's declaration that the king had vouchsafed his royal promise under his hand and broad seal that no person in this colony shall be molested or questioned for the matters of conscience to God, so he be loyal and keep the civil peace. So the year before Williams died, the charter was still on his mind, and he wrote again that it was nothing short of revolutionary, and Williams reflected that perhaps his greatest contribution could have been that religious freedom was not simply that he espoused the theory of it, but that he created this geographical space where those principles could be lived. And I feel like without an instrument of civil government for Rhode Island, William's laudable opinions would have simply just remained theoretical, like so many other people, right, in the early 17th century. So William's journey to make his vision for soul liberty had been long and complicated. In between 1644 and then the charter in 1663, Williams wrote extensively on the idea of religious freedom in both published works and private letters. And one of his most powerful and direct defences was in an open letter to the town of Providence in 1655, which is one of my favourite letters to teach to students because it's short and really easy to understand. And he uses this analogy of a ship, and he argues that that religious freedom is the way forward. But as he says in this letter to Providence, religious freedom does not mean citizens could shy away from civil law and responsibilities. And I think this particular letter shows that soul liberty had enormous political and secular implications. And in reality, as we'll see, balancing religious liberty whilst maintaining a flourishing commonwealth was really not so straightforward. So Williams used his time in England in the 1640s to formally gather his thoughts on religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Can you press for me, Bob, please? Brilliant, thank you. And Williams published one of his most famous defences, if not the most famous, infamous perhaps is a better term, defences of religious liberty in the Western world when he published The Bloody Tenon. And scholars have long noted the importance of William's seminal work on soul liberty. So what's really interesting to me is the process about how this book came to be. So it was not submitted to the censor for approval, nor was it licensed. And the book, though, sold rapidly initially, so much so that within a few weeks a second edition appeared. Basically, as soon as the book comes out, Williams, leaves for Rhode Island before his book had really even come off the printing press, basically leaving everyone in England really outraged. And what's really surprising to me is the reaction of people who themselves had been persecuted. So, even people who'd been persecuted for their religion themselves couldn't stomach how bold William's treatise was. So in August of 1644, Edmund Calney ordered for the public hangman to burn William's book because it advocated for tolerating all sorts of religion. And this makes me pause, right? Burning a book is not just this symbolic act of disapproval. It's also a concerted attempt to kind of get rid of the book itself, the ideas within the book itself, to kind of get rid of it out of this world. And the following month after this, Lazarus Seaman preached right before Parliament on Fast Day, and he basically says that The Bloody Tenon was one of the most dangerous books of the time. So this is the impact that it has. And in the sermon, Lazarus Seaman, he acknowledged that William's work had been burnt by order. And he warned, and I quote again, that the shell is sometimes thrown into the fire when the kernel is eaten as a sweet morsel. So John Barry's looked at this, and I'm quoting some of Barry's statistics here. Barry says that between 1644 and 1649, at least 60 pamphlets directly addressed Roger Williams' Bloody Tenon, and at least 120 more quoted him. So it's not well received, but everyone's talking about it. So it seems that that kernel that Williams planted in the Bloody Tenon was bold from start to finish, and Williams unflinchingly addressed both houses of Parliament, the Lords and the Commons, in the dedication. And he cites reason, religion and experience to advocate for separation of church and state throughout the book's 400-odd pages. And I'm just going to share a couple of quotes. William states plainly, God requireth not uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state. And his 12th and final point in this kind of bullet point list of arguments he makes in the opening said that Christianity could flourish anywhere, notwithstanding the permission of diverse and contrary consciences. So, Christianity can flourish anywhere, no matter what your neighbours may think. So in The Bloody Tenon, Williams uses politics, economics, practical applications and theology to justify his views. Politically, Williams rejects this prevalent view that religious uniformity was necessary for a good society. And he argued that intolerance, and I quote again from the Bloody Tenet, is destructive to the civil peace and welfare of all kingdoms, countries and commonwealths. And he cited lessons from the lamentable experiences of present and former slaughters. And he's got all these really cool specific case studies. I mean, I really struggle to read this sometimes, right? It's not my favorite thing of Williams to read. And, you know, I read it every year or so when I'm teaching it. I don't want to say force myself, but, you know, I heavily encourage myself to reread it every time I teach it. And I've just finished rereading it because I'm just about to start teaching it again next week in the Roger seminar. And it's heavy going, right? It's not like the Letter to the Providence or even like a Key into the Language that is a little bit more easy to read. But one of the things that really caught my eye when I reread this for however many time when I was writing this chapter was the example that he gives of Amsterdam. Right, and here he talks about how Amsterdam had actually been a really poor fishing town until it became a haven for dissenters, and then it transformed into a really bustling trading hub. So he gives all these like really far-flung examples about all the good stuff that religious freedom can bring. You know, and then he talks about the religious wars in Europe and the religious upheaval in England to demonstrate clearly that persecution produced nothing but false converts who simply sought to evade punishment. And every time I teach this, I ask my students, what would you do, right? Like, would you go for truth or peace? And they're always like, we'd go for peace, right? We wouldn't stick up for the truth. We'd be too scared. And I understand that view. So I feel like Williams makes the point in the Bloody Tenet that even those who stayed true to their faith and died for their dedication simply became martyrs, which only served to harden their followers' reserves. So we know then that Williams did not publish the Bloody Tenet in a vacuum, and the pamphlet was part of a broader pamphlet war between Williams and Massachusetts Bay Minister John Cotton. And again, when I'm teaching this to my students, I always say that this is like the 17th century Twitter war, right? Like one of them publishes a pamphlet, and another one comes back, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And it reminds me of like how tweets work today. And one of the things, I've just started a project, which I think is probably going to be a journal article on Mary Williams. And, you know, I didn't know that how her dad, right, who is called Richard Bernard, who's based in England, he is writing to John Cotton in like the 1630s, and those letters survive. Like what, and there were no surviving letters between Roger and his father-in-law, and like Roger's father-in-law is writing to the guy he goes into a massive like publishing war with. So like, what's the deal with that? And I say that because I don't know. I'm still in the midst of researching that. So if anyone knows any more about the Barnard family, then I'd love to talk to you. So yeah, so that's really interesting to me. Anyway, this is not about that. That's perhaps a future talk in a year or two when I have more time to write. So as Williams discovered then, living with and within the reality of religious freedom was perhaps easier said than done. And I'm just going to give one kind of quick example of the Quakers as a case study, right? I feel like it's fair to say that Williams didn't like the Quakers. He believed that and I quote again, their religion is not only a heresy in the matter of worship, but also the doctrines of repentance faith. And he held that the Quakers, and I quote again, were the most obstructive and destructive religion to conversion and salvation than most of the religions of this day in the world. He hated their writings too, and I quote again, he says, their many books and writings are extremely poor, lame, naked, and held up only with high titles and boasting words of vapour. So he's not really got much good to say there about them. And so the Quakers in the 17th century believed that they were guided by an inner light that compelled them to spread their message to others, no matter what that consequence might be. And in the 17th century, Quakers were known for their dramatic speeches, which they gave anywhere from the courthouse to in front of the church. And Quakers routinely in the 17th century ignored common social conventions, you know, refusing to doff their cap to superiors, to refusing to fully clothe themselves in public. So Quakers were seen really in the 17th century English early modern Atlantic world as really dangerous religious heretics. And moreover, they stressed that everyone had direct access to God and that churches were obsolete. So you can imagine how it was particularly stressful in Massachusetts and Plymouth. So unsurprisingly then, Quakers faced intense persecution both in England and New England. And so even though Williams really was deeply troubled by the Quaker faith, you know, Rhode Island allowed sanctuary to the Quakers. And Williams remained committed to living what he theorized about. So when Quaker leader George Fox visited Rhode Island can you press for me, please? When Quaker leader George Fox was scheduled to visit Rhode Island in 1672, Williams invited him to a public theological debate rather than just kick him out, right? So whilst Fox had left the colony and did not rise to Williams' challenge, 3 of his followers, John Stubbs, John Burnet, and William Edmondson, debated Williams in public. And the first part of this debate took place down at the Quaker Meeting House in Newport in August of 1672. And Williams rode all the way, right, from Providence down to Newport. And I actually was following the news that people are recreating this, right? They've been in training for this, ready for the big anniversary. And like that puts me in awe. It really, really does. And I'm curious to see how that goes. So he's like 70 odd when he does this, right? And it's not just like a quick jolly from here across there, right? It's a long way. It's physically hard. So by the time that Williams gets down to Newport, a large crowd had gathered and an intense and spirited debate ensued and lasted for several days. The final 7 propositions were then debated for another full day up in Providence. So in 1676, what you see on the screen is what Williams published. So Williams published an account of the debate. I love the pun, right? George Fox digged out of his burrows. I like that. That's perfect. I love it. And the following year, Fox and Burnet responded with a New England firebrand quenched. So I think what's laudable here then is Williams' commitment to arguing points of scripture with the Quakers, both in person and in print, suggesting that he believed that their uncivil practice was probably the result of a genuine spiritual error. Williams wanted to offer salvation to them through showing them their errors. And so in allowing the Quakers to settle in Rhode Island and having this theological debate with them, rather than just doing what everyone else was doing, like shoving them in prison, banishing them, or putting them to death, Williams put his own personal views of the Quakers aside and allowed soul liberty to flourish in the colony. And I think this shows that lived reality, again, of the lively experiment. So Williams' experiment in religious freedom had particular implications for his interactions with indigenous peoples. Writing to John Winthrop Jr. in 1632, Williams acknowledged, and I quote, "What I long after is the native souls." All right, so that's not a quote that we often hear, right? Like he longs to convert them. However, Williams reflected, he knew, and I quote again, that false worship stinks in God's nostrils. So what was he to do? So Williams did not believe, thinking about how he grew up in England, on imposing Christian beliefs or English culture upon the Indians against their will. And Williams believed that nobody or any earthly church had a monopoly on religious truths. Think about the spiritual journey he himself had gone through, right, growing up Church of England and then making his way through. And he kind of compelled the Indians to seek the truth. And Williams simultaneously believed that Indians conjured the devil, and I quote again, laboured in spiritual darkness, and their behaviour at times was barbarous, while simultaneously he was trying to learn all he could about their spiritual and temporal words. So it's complicated, right? Can you press for me, Bob, if that's all right? Thank you. In A Key into the Language of America, which you see the title page here, Williams noted that the Narragansett, I quote, have a modest religious persuasion not to disturb any man, either themselves, English, Dutch, or any in their conscience and worship, and therefore say, peace, hold your peace. And so Williams pushed this idea of equality in the eyes of God further in A Key, in one of perhaps his most famous quotes. This bit over here is where I'm going to go. And this is the quote that everybody likes to give, right? Not I long for native souls, but this quote, so I'll give you both. He says, so despite his desires and endeavours to attain a property of language, he lamented that conversion was not possible, and he said in a letter, it's out of the question to me that I may not pretend a false conversion. And he says, I'm going to pick up the quote here. He says, nature holds no difference between Europe and Americans in blood, birth, bodies, and so on. And so again, he exhorted his countrymen, boast not proud English of thy birth and blood, thy brother Indian is by birth as good. Of one blood God made him and thee and all, as wise, as fair, as strong, as personal. So it's always interesting to me, again, when I'm teaching this text, that they're using the term American in this 17th century sense to mean indigenous. So we know then that Williams consolidated his views on Indigenous conversion in his 1645 pamphlet, Christians Make Not Christians. And could you press for me in a second, Bob? Thank you. And despite his desires and endeavours to attain a property of language, he never thought it was going to be possible to them, and he hated the idea of a false conversion. So in light of William's views on false conversions, it's not surprising that he objected to the work of John Eliot, who was a missionary from Massachusetts Bay, who translated the Bible that you see it here into Wampanoag and set up praying towns. So yeah, he has real beef with Eliot. So I want to think a bit now as we move into the final bit of this presentation to think about Williams's legacy. I'm mindful of the clock, it's 6:43. I'm not going to be one of those people who talk for hours and as the sun is setting. So let's think about his legacy. I'm going to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So I think traditional biographies of Williams are prone to depicting him as being ahead of his time, both in his dealings with the Indians and his calls for religious liberty. And I want to try and push back on this and say perhaps this wasn't the case. Williams was not a man out of his times, or indeed ahead of his day. Whilst he had many remarkable ideas and he did his absolute best to live up to them, his feet were very firmly here on the Narragansett earth. And I think debates about religious toleration had also been raging for centuries when Williams founded Providence in 1636. For example, Sebastian Castello, a French preacher and theologian, steadfastly advocated for religious tolerance in the 16th century. Hugo Grotius, a Dutch legal scholar and philosopher, pushed for toleration of dissent and individual rights also in the 17th century. Other places experimented too with the lived reality of religious toleration. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg allowed subjects within different territories of the Holy Roman Empire to emigrate to another territory if they objected to the religion of their local leader. However, though, this was limited, right? It only applied to Catholics and Lutherans. And the Dutch moved consistently towards toleration, but only kind of because they had to. Catholics lived alongside Calvinists following the fracturing from Spain in 1570s. So the United Providence showed this, what I would say, de facto toleration, right? They live it, but they don't make it law. You know, each Dutch province still had a state church, and the Dutch persecuted the Arminians well after 1609. So what I'm trying to say to you is other people theorize about it and try to live it, but it's really no match for what happens here, right? So these efforts were really no match for Rhode Island's bold experiment in religious freedom for all. Williams did not simply advocate for religious toleration, he went further and created a place where religious freedom, not simply toleration, and again this is a point we can talk about in the Q&A, ruled. So Williams' lively experiment went beyond what his famed contemporaries John Milton, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke called for. Moreover, Williams, unlike Milton, Hobbes and Locke, actually puts theory into practice, living out his experiment in soul liberty. And could you press for me, Bob, if that's okay, please? So Teresa Bijan, I don't know if you've heard of this book. It came out a couple of years ago. She's a professor at Oxford, back across the pond. She argues in her book Mere Civility that scholars are inspired both by the breadth and liberty of Williams' toleration, and because of that, like to incorrectly portray him as this kind of enlightened proto-liberal running around the New England wilderness. And she makes a really clear point that I buy into, that Williams did not support religious freedom because he was open-minded or enlightened, whatever that might mean. He was a religious fanatic, even by modern and early modern standards. He was not a multiculturalist before that was even a thing. Which sounds like a negative thing, but it's not, right? Like when we think about Williams in his 17th century term, what Bijan taught, his mere civility, permitted Williams to be extraordinary in other ways, right? It allowed him to consider what modern day people want to rule out. He tolerated people because he thought they might all be converts one day. So he's this unlikely hero, I feel like, in the story of religious freedom, and I think he challenges what we think of as a tolerant or a civil society. And this book is really cool. She gave a guest lecture at Roger Williams University when it came out 2 years ago, and the guest lecture is just over an hour long, and if you just type in Teresa Bijan, Roger Williams, it comes up. And then her book has a chapter on Williams, Locke and Hobbes, so it's a really worth a read. So to conclude then, Ultimately, what made Roger Williams different to the others who called for religious freedom was that he actually succeeded in putting theory into practice. He crafted a colony built on de jure freedom and separation of church and state. Williams was not ahead of his time, but his colony was indeed one of the most forward-thinking experiments of the time. Williams advocated for religious freedom from the standpoint of a deeply religious believer using theology to advocate for the rights of others to worship. As we know, he despised the Quaker theology and he thought Catholics served the Antichrist. He refused to watch certain indigenous religious rituals for fear of being an eyewitness or spectator, in case he was mistaken for being a partaker of Satan's inventions and worships. He considered all of these religions false, but nonetheless he defended their right to hold and practice their religion without any state interference, who seemed to him to be intent on causing discord and strife. So this is my last little bit. So putting theory into practice is really never easy. That's the lesson I think that we find here, especially when the odds are stacked against you. Williams' lively experiment cost him dearly, right? I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but some of my favourite letters, if you can just press for me one more time, Bob, are these letters that survive in the Wren Library at Trinity College in Cambridge between Roger and Anne Sadler, who is Edward Cook's daughter. Anne Sadler loves the Church of England, like she loves it. Capital letters, exclamation mark. She's a strong Church of England person. And when Williams goes back to England, he writes to her, sharing his new book, sends her a copy, and she just hates him. Like she just puts him in his place and she wishes him dead. And, these letters are like him writing to her all nice and whatever. And you can see here, I'm sorry, it's a bit blurry, but this is where he writes the address to her, and this is her notes in the margin when she basically says, if he comes back to this country, Tyburn should make his welcome, i.e. should die and be hung. So it costs him dearly, right? Like even childhood friends turn against him, so his views made him many adversaries. He was banished. His masterpiece, The Bloody Tenant, was burned. His neighbours fought. He had to live alongside those he despised. His colony was viewed with contempt, and his long-term acquaintances, such as Anne Sadler, wished him dead. His house and town were burnt down in the midst of King Philip's War, and he lived his final years in poverty. But I think Williams was successful, right? In the face of all of this opposition and hardship, Williams ultimately succeeded in crafting the architecture of religious liberty. His experiment in soul liberty created the freest place the Western world had perhaps ever seen. So Roger Williams not only theorized about religious freedom, he lived it, whatever the cost. And I'll end there and I'll take some questions.